at a international UFO conference in Acapulco, just like this. And I had gone down with Jim Lorenzen, who was the head of APRO, the first UFO civilian or civilian UFO research organization in the world, organized right here in Tucson. We flew down to Acapulco. Hynek had been invited to speak there, and we had dinner with Hynek the first night because he and Jim Lorenzen knew each other. And I found him to be an affable man. He didn't say much because he had learned not to commit himself on a position over the swamp gas and several other things that already happened by then. So when I came back from Switzerland with the photographs and the information that I was collecting in the Swiss case, I released some of the information in a meeting like this in Oakland, California one time. It was immediately attacked by everybody because they didn't have it, including all the clubs, including my own club in Tucson, APRO. They said that I stole their case. But I went there to find out about it myself for the first time. Anyway, I got a call a couple of years into the investigation of the case from a woman in Tucson, in Phoenix, asking me if I could come to Tucson and tell her about the Pleiades case. And I said, yeah, I can, but that's a little inconvenient. Is it important? She says, I think it's important. I think you'll find it important. So I agreed, and I drove up to Phoenix, and I met her in the afternoon. She said, come about supper time, we'll have a bite to eat. I got there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I rang her doorbell, and she opened the door, and she said, there's somebody here I want you to meet. And she opened the door a little further, and there's Hynek standing there, and he greeted me. He said, hello. He said, come on in. And I went in, and he said, now I would like you to tell me something about this Pleiades case you're investigating. But he said, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm not going to answer any questions. He said, I don't want to be committed in any way on this, but I'd like you to tell me what you know. So I showed him some of the pictures and told him something about the case, and he listened patiently, and we got through. He just thanked me, and I picked up my stuff and left. He never did really attack the Pleiades case, but everybody else all did because they weren't included in it. MUFON attacked me because we didn't include them in the investigation. Now, there's a reason why we didn't. I've never been a member of any UFO organization because they're always backbiting each other. So I tried to stay out of that, but I was closely associated with APRO because I knew Coral and Jim very well, and I used to help them put out their bulletin. I helped them file material in the office. I helped them in many ways because I was retired and had time to do it. Helped them prepare their newsletter. But they kind of turned against me when I came back with the Pleiades case and wouldn't turn it over to them. Now, the reason I didn't turn it over to them is none of these clubs had any money to investigate anything. They published a little bulletin, their subscriptions to the bulletin barely paid for it, but they had no fund to send anybody anywhere to investigate anything. So I had to go on my own time and my own money, and I figured, if that's the case, why should I try to give it all to them? And it was going to take some serious research of the data that I was bringing. I had metal samples, I had plastic samples, I had a lot of things to be tested. And again, they had no money to do any of this. All of this is going to require money for testing. So I involved some other people with me to help finance some of the work that we were doing. So it was for this reason that most of the clubs now, the APRO began to publish attacks on the case in their own APRO journal, which I was helping them write. and they criticized the Swiss farmers, saying that he was a fraud and a fake, and that he might even be fooling some of our investigators, and a few things like that. So I quit coordinating information with them. I just decided I don't need all the problem, and they reached the stage where they even took my key away and wouldn't let me in the office anymore. Went on my own money. I never would have gone back a second time on my own money or anybody's money if I had ever had any reason to suspect fraud or funny business in the case. When I got there, I found the most sincere, honest guy I ever saw. He looked you straight in the eye when he talked to you, looked right into your soul, and he didn't look away. When I asked him questions about making models and things like that, he showed me the models. He said, I can't make one. I have one arm. I can't even cover anything. But he said, I do get models. His first one was from a 12-year-old neighbor boy in a shop class at school. He turned one out on a lathe, waxed it out, and brought it to him. He had it on his desk. He showed that one to me. And he says, Others brought me other models. He said, yeah, they're models, but they're not the real thing. He says, models are easy to tell. So anyway, the case had a lot going for it. He had the best photographs I'd ever seen. And that's usually suspect. If the pictures are good, they're probably too good. But these stood all the testing that we could give them. And even over, more than 20 years of testing now, we haven't been able to find any way that they could have been faked. They're not montages, they're not double images, none of the regular things. Now we learned, in the process of testing these things, we learned a lot. We learned that we can take a still two-dimensional photograph, and by examining the photograph with computers and measuring pixels and everything else, we can find out if any object in the picture is moving, which direction it's moving, and about how fast, by counting the pixels on the edges. We found that we can estimate distance from the camera with respect to other objects in the picture by 6 different methods. One of them is haze factor, gray factor, color saturation, depth of field, well, counting pixels is a good example. Also, that has to do with the dispersion of light over distance. The less sharp the field is, the further the light has traveled. So when we apply all 6 of those methods and find that the result is roughly within 10% of each other, and when we measured one of the pictures, for example, and found that the craft was hovering over a log pile 120 yards away, then knowing the geometry of the lens, we just simple mathematics, you can multiply it out and find that if that's 20 yards from the lens and it's that size in the image frame, then it's got to be 20 feet in diameter. And the witness was telling us it was about 7 meters in diameter, which is about 21 feet. So all of our tests came out like that. There are other tests for color shading, reflection of light from different sources around it. If it's a small model, it reflects it differently from a large object. And so there were people that come along and said, oh, he made them with models. We can make pictures just like that with models in 10 minutes. So there's a fellow, Michael Horn, that has taken the debunkers on out there in California, and he offered a lot of money for anybody that could duplicate just one picture. After a year with no duplications, he offered to, he said, well, you didn't do it with everything open. You had a freehand to do it any way you could, all the technicians you want, all of that you want, in a laboratory if you like, and everything else. He said, now I'd like to narrow it down a little bit. He said the man had a broken camera. He couldn't change the focus. His focus was jammed just a little bit short of infinity, about a 32nd, a 16th of an inch maybe, short of the infinity focus on his camera. It had been dropped and the ring was bent and it was jammed. The same action broke the mirror loose beside the lens viewer, so he couldn't look through the camera anymore, and he had to shoot all of his pictures from the hip, so to speak. So then he said, and you should do it with all those settings. You should be stuck with the infinity setting, fixed focus, no lens. Another one. He shot everything at 125th of a second with his broken camera. All of it was shot on ASA 100 slide transparency film. He said, now I'd like to limit you to some of those. He didn't get anything for another year, and he said, well, you didn't do it that way. Now let's do it with one arm. This man has only one arm besides his broken camera. Still no response, so he's ordered the people that offered money for anybody that could come up with a picture. He told them they ought to pay up, because Billy will make another one for them. I am absolutely convinced. I found other eyewitnesses. I didn't go around the neighborhood knocking doors wherever these things happened. And I found other witnesses that didn't know anything about Billy Meier, and he didn't know anything about them, that had seen something descend into the woods nearby and rise from the woods 20 minutes later at the same time that Billy was having a contact. I found a man that was a computer programmer that lived on a hill overlooking one of the sites, and he had come home from work one day, saw the object slowly descending into the clearing behind the trees, landed behind the trees. He called his wife out. They both stood there and watched for 25 or 30 minutes until it rose in the air and flew away. They never heard of Billy Meier, and Meier never heard of them, but we found them just by knocking doors in the neighborhoods looking for anybody that had ever seen anything strange out there. And we found a number of them. Oh, I'm absolutely convinced that it's real. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And I went back 12 or 13 times. I lived in the household with the man and his family for 81 days overall, collectively. And I knew all of them very well. And I was there one day when I'd been there for 4 or 5 days already, living in the household with them, sleeping in one of the rooms in their bedrooms in their house. When he got up one morning, it'd been raining all the day before and the night before, and he got up, and it was wet and soggy outside, and he had a cold, he thought he was coming down with the flu. He was a heavy smoker, and he didn't light a cigarette. He drank a lot of coffee. He didn't take coffee. He walked around a little bit, went and laid down on a sofa in the living room in front of the television set. Stayed there all day long. He didn't feel like getting up. He hadn't drunk any water. They brought him water, and he didn't drink it. He didn't drink coffee. He didn't smoke. And by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I hear him. I'm watching the television with my back to him, and I heard a movement. And I looked around, and he's down there like this, motioning for me to come over. So I went over there and bent down to see what he had. He said, "Get Elsie." So I went to get Elsie. She was one of the women in the household there. And she came and did the same thing, and he told her something, and she went to get his wife, and between the two of them, they picked him up and walked him down the hallway to his bedroom. They evidently put him in a tub, because for every contact he had, he changed all of his clothes from the inside out, wearing all fresh clothes, having taken a bath if he had time, just before leaving. So they left his underclothes in there, and his wife came out with a shirt and jeans, which he always wore, and she put up the ironing board and started ironing those, and Elsie brought the boots out and started washing those, scrubbing them up, then polished them and set them aside. Then he came walking out. His wife took the shirt and pants in. He came walking out with the shirt and pants on, and she took the empty sleeve and pinned it up for him. And Elsie had laid out his pistol, gun, and a walkie-talkie. And he sat down at the table, and he took the pistol out of the holster, opened the barrel, dumped the cartridges out, looked down the barrel at both, and put them all back in, put it back together, put it in the holster, strapped it on. Then he took the walkie-talkie, opened it up, dumped the batteries out, put fresh batteries in it. No matter how bad the other batteries were, I thought this might be a waste of equipment. Maybe it will work, but he didn't want to take any chances on it not working. They'd had problems already with it. For lack of that. So they had learned how to prepare for the meeting. So now he's all ready to go, and he's dressed, and it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. This all started about 5:30. Well, it's probably closer to 6:30. The men had come in from work, had seen what was going on, went and washed up and came back, sat down at the table. The women had served them supper, and Billy and his wife and Elsie are standing at the end of the table by the cook stove. Over the stove was a clock with a round face with big numbers on it. And I'm on the far end of the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee. When he raised his hand in a little signal like that, he got the final word to go telepathically and started out the door. I set my coffee cup down so hard I spilled it, ran around the table, following him out. I want to see him go this time. So I've never been able to catch him this close to a departure. And I got out the kitchen door, which went down 2 steps to the ground, and in a lean-to shed that went to the end of the house with a spring-loaded door that opened inward. So I got on the ground out there in time to see his heels going through the end door, and I ran about 8 or 9 steps to it, jerked it open. I don't want to miss anything, and there out in the wet ground in the mud was 1, 2, 3 steps like that, no 4th step. And so I looked all around. There's no noise, no lights. It's quiet. The rain is still falling. And I thought, gee, and I missed it. And so I stayed out there in the rain until I got soaking wet. And I went back in to change clothes, and I put dry clothes on, and somebody gave me a raincoat. And I was going back out I didn't want to miss anything. I'm going to be there when he comes back. And as I came down the stairs, I saw in the living room the Germans are standing in front of the television set watching it. So I went over and looked over their shoulder to see what they're watching, and there was a black screen with a white cross that said in German, "The Pope has died." So I said, how did he die? And they said, we don't know. The program just stopped and this came on the screen. I watched for maybe 30 seconds or more, but I don't want to miss what's going on outside. So I went back outside in the rain to wait for Billy to come back. And I was out there about 15 or 20 more minutes when a telephone rang and somebody answered it upstairs, and they raised the window and said, he's down over at Elg and you can go with Jacobus and his wife to pick him up. Well, Elg was on the other side of the mountain. His walkie-talkie is line of sight, so he had to use a telephone to call home. He walked from wherever they let him out, probably right in front of a guest house. When we got in a black Volkswagen, splish and splash through puddles, rain splashing all over the windshield and over the top of the car, trying to get to him. And he had gone out in the rain, and now we're going to pick him up, still in the rain, someplace else. He's standing under one of those little 3-board roofs over a 3-step landing on the side of a guest house, which is closed for the night. And he's not wet. Doesn't have any raindrops on his jacket. His hair is dry. His shoes only had a little bit of mud around the soles, nothing on the top. You know, if you walk on a muddy street, you get mud on the top and everything everywhere else. He didn't have any of that. So he got in the car, and trying to make conversation, he just looked forward. He didn't want to talk, and I tried several times. I just gave up and leaned back. We got back to the house. Took us about 15 minutes to go each direction. And they went inside, and he walked into the living room. The Germans followed him in there, closed the door. So I knew that they were going to get whatever information he wanted to tell them, and that I probably wasn't invited at that stage. I waited a couple hours, never did open up, so I went up and went to bed. The next morning I came down early, and one of the girls came down shortly, just a few minutes after I was going to make me some coffee, came down. I said, what time did the meeting break up last night? She said, oh, not last night. I said, well, when did it break up? She said, about 6 o'clock this morning. I said, oh, God, he'd be sleeping on late, huh? She said, well, he'll be up soon. So about 9 o'clock, he got up and came out, and he just nodded a greeting to me at the table. I was sitting there drinking a cup of coffee. They brought him one. He sat down for a minute, then he looked at me and jerked his head like that for me to follow him, and we got up and went outside to sit on the patio. And we sat down. I'm dying to find out what happened that night. I knew he had gone to a contact, and I'm fresh after the contact, and I want whatever he can tell. I said, gee, Bill, I said, can you tell me what happened last night? He looked at me with kind of sad eyes, and he said, I watched him murder a pope. I said, you got to be kidding. We don't murder popes anymore. They might have done that in the Dark Ages. It's the modern world. We don't murder popes. He said, I watched them murder a pope. And I said, a pope? This is Pope Paul VI. I said, a pope? Can't be. And he said, yes. He said, I watched everything on viewing screens. Now, this has never been published either. He said, they showed me a screen of the Vatican, several views in the Vatican, one of his desk, one of his bedroom, one in the kitchen. The Pope is getting ready for bed. He went to bed about 8:30 in the evening usually. And they all knew this. And his manservant is in the kitchen preparing a warm tea that he customarily took before he got into bed. And he's at a table in the kitchen preparing the tea, and there's a cardinal standing there in his cardinal's frock, cassock or whatever it is, with his hands in the pockets. And the manservant got the tray ready and looked at it, and then he left and went into through an arch at the side and over to another room to get a fresh linen napkin. While he was doing that, the cardinal took his hand out of his pocket with a little bottle in it, took the stopper out, put 2 drops in the tea, put the stopper back and put it back in his pocket. When the manservant came out, the cardinal was standing there just like he was before, with his hands in his pockets. The manservant picked up the tray and took it into that pope, left it with him, and came out and went about 5 minutes. Then he went down and opened the door and looked in on the pope. If you remember, the Vatican put out the word that a chambermaid found him the next morning, that was the first one to see him dead. Well, there's a cardinal who saw him dead before that. When he was sure that he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, he went to the Pope's office and took a folder off the desk. And the lady showed Meier on the screen what was in the folder. It was a report of the losses of the Vatican, huge loss, millions of dollars of losses from the Vatican treasury and bad investments with the mafia. And the Pope had discovered, that Pope, Paul VI, had discovered this and was going to report the loss the next morning, going to call a news conference, report the loss, and appoint an investigative committee. Well, the investigative committee would have got several of the people that are involved in the loss. The treasurer, the highest ranking cardinal that serves as the secretary for that pope, and a couple others. And so Meier says, then they told him what chemical was used was in the bottle. And it's a chemical, I don't remember the name now, but the chemical is a chemical that's used by intelligence that causes, for assassinations, that causes a cramp in the heart that lasts about 10 minutes, long enough to kill you. And the chemical is so volatile that it evaporates out of the body in the heat of the body itself and is gone.